Hello, everybody. This is Brian Jacobs. A few months ago, four of us, all from different disciplines, set up a collective called Crater Lake and Company. And the idea behind Crater Lake was to help marketers pull together all of that massive amount of data and research they had at their disposal and summarize, distill, crystallize that into a clear performance narrative that they could use within the business. So for marketers and non-marketers within their own organizations, as well as with their partner agencies and other suppliers. What we are doing as a part of all this is a series of interviews with sort of marketing luminaries from different disciplines and coming from different directions to talk to us about the whole principle of sort of making sense of it all. Making sense of it all is what we try to do within Crater Lake, and the concept of making sense of it all seems to me highly relevant in this day and age. And so today I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Paul Feldwick. Paul is the author of two absolutely brilliant books, one called The Anatomy of Humbug, and the latest one called Why Does the Peddler Sing, which much recommended to everybody who's interested in the world of advertising. In a previous life, before he became a best-selling author, he was head of account planning at BMP. So welcome, Paul.
Hi, thanks.
Paul, in your writing and in your books, you've talked a bit about how advertising seems to have lost its way by becoming a bit disconnected, as it were, from popular culture. What do you think that's down to? And is it down to a lack of appreciation of what's happening in popular culture, or are we becoming too inwardly obsessed about, our own business? What do you think's behind that?
Yeah, I think the answer to that, I'm afraid, is complicated, and we haven't got long, but it goes back actually a very long way. I think it goes right back to about 1900, when the modern advertising agency started to take itself seriously and wanted to look professional. And right from that date, you can see how agencies really wanted to differentiate themselves and distance themselves from the mountebanks and medicine shows and impresarios who are in many ways their antecedents. So that by 1910, as early as that, the trade magazine Printers Inc. refused to celebrate the centenary of P.T. Barnum's death because they said he stood for everything that modern advertising was not. It was vulgar, it was bizarre, it pandered to the lowest of the low, and all this sort of thing. And in its place, they built this dominant discourse about how advertising works, which is that it's not about entertainment, it's about serious selling, it's about giving facts, and it's about rational persuasion. And that has continued to be very dominant, ever since in many ways, despite the fact that as media developed, of course, the industry was inexorably drawn back towards the worlds of entertainment. When radio comes along in the 20s and television comes along in the 50s, the agencies are actually very involved, not just in producing the ads, but in producing the programs. And there's a very blurred line between ads and programs in the early days of both those media. And yet, even within the advertising agencies, you can tell that a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. This is a cheap business and I don't want it, as a character says in The Hucksters. Now, I think one other thing then happened, which sort of added a new dimension to this, which is around the 1960s and around Bill Bernbach. Agencies found a different way of sort of making themselves feel special and professional, which was a bit more sexy and a bit more cool than just being the sort of rational persuaders. And this was this idea of creativity, a word that was never very clearly defined, but seemed to stand for some sort of, quasi-artistic quality that agencies were brilliant at, and which could only really be appreciated by other people in advertising. And it began to sort of drift away from that point, from the public. Now, for a long time, I think this was relatively harmless. It might even have been in some ways a positive thing. But I think that, like some sort of very slow growing tumor or something, this has now grown in the last couple of decades to being so dominant that it has sort of taken over the way the advertising business thinks of itself. So we now have this situation where, for many people in advertising, the idea of being too popular is just something they shy away from. And certainly creative awards, I think, have played quite a key role in this process. So I think it's not something that's happened overnight. It's not something you can put down to one single factor, but it has now grown to being, I think, a dominant discourse that means there's quite a gulf between what a lot of agencies think they ought to be doing and the world of popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that these days agencies are just sort of rather disconnected from what consumers think about things? I mean, just generally, I mean, they seem
I think there's a lot of evidence that, you know, people who work in agencies tend to form a very homogenous and very particular group who share a lot of cultural values, which are on the whole quite remote from a great deal of the country. And this has been well documented elsewhere, that, you know, that they are accused of being, you know, sort of elite and sort of based around the capital rather than the regions, and certainly there is a class thing here that I think is quite marked. I mean, I made a throwaway remark in an interview with Campaign, which they then put on the front cover, about the difference between Fleabag and Mrs. Brown's Boys. And in various ways, I think this proved to be quite controversial, because Mrs. Brown's Boys sort of stands for everything that sort of elite group would not want to touch with a barge pole, and yet it's hugely popular. You know, it was the best-selling Christmas video a couple of years ago, and it attracts huge audiences, and it is very much a sort of part of that carnival, musical, popular entertainment tradition, which the industry has become increasingly sort of wary of touching.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's also we seem to have got to a point where we're completely obsessed with the short term and sort of short term measures and things like that, as opposed to sort of building brands over the long term? I mean, do you think that as we move towards more sort of short term media forms and addressable advertising and things that, you know, just to which you have to react really quickly, do you think the sort of separation of media from creative sort of, you know, in a way sort of makes that whole situation worse? I mean, it's now a good time to talk about maybe them coming a bit closer together again.
I mean, I agree with you, certainly, that the short-termism, again, is another thing that's been well documented and much talked about. It's difficult to know how one really shifts that, because if its roots are right at the core of what a business is trying to do, then it's very difficult to make that argument that building a brand is a good thing. I mean, I was looking at evidence recently that, you know, brands that are owned by sort of venture capital companies are not really interested in the long term. And you can see that their share prices don't go up because they're not planning for the long term. They don't care, because that's not what they're in it for. They just kind of want to rank up the short-term profits and then sell it on. So if there is a short-term attitude right at the heart of a business, but of course, you know, not all businesses are like that. But those who want to be building for the long term, I think there is a very strong case to be made for branding. And Mark Ritson recently wrote something I thought rather good about this, saying it's actually quite difficult to persuade a board, but it can be done, and it does require a lot of skills on the part of the CMO to do that. But I think, you know, certainly that is one great divide that needs to be addressed by whatever means. And of course, in terms of the other point about creative and media, I really can't make an argument that says why they should be kept apart. Whatever bringing them back together might mean, I think it's something that we should all be thinking about. And certainly one important aspect of that is, I mean, not so much in the level of, you know, because we are putting this ad here, this is how you write the ad, although that may be a part of it. It's more to do with how both those skills are looking at the same reality, are looking at the same information, and are addressing the same needs. That they are both addressing the same task of brand building, and they're both looking at the same sort of data, the same sort of information, and they are working within that same framework. And I guess that used to be much more the case when creative and media were together in the same agencies. I suppose the intention behind account planning in its origins, whether it was realized or not, was very similar to what you're trying to do at Crater Lake, which it was always saying there is more and more information and data around, but it is not being brought together, it is not being coordinated, and it's not being used in a holistic way. And I think at its best, we were able to do that. You know, I mean, at BMP and at JWT, media planning and account planning were very, very close. And that brought the whole thing together. And the planners were the people who were pulling all the data sources together and interpreting it and helping to make sense of it, which is precisely what you're doing now. I think that that perennially remains something that's important to do. So yes, I think whatever it means, bringing creative and media back together is something that is probably overdue.
Very good place to stop. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Paul.
That's a pleasure, Brian. Thanks very much for asking me.